The dawn of sound in cinema revolutionized Hollywood, but for many silent film stars, it marked the end of an era and their careers. From iconic actors whose voices didn't match their on-screen personas to those who struggled to adapt to the new demands of talkies, the transition to sound was both brutal and heartbreaking. In this video, we'll uncover the untold stories of 15 silent film legends who lost it all when the industry changed forever. Stick around. You won't believe how some of these careers came to a screeching halt. John Gilbert, one of the most beloved leading men of the silent film era, saw his career unravel with the arrival of sound films. Known for his striking looks and emotional performances, Gilbert was a major box office draw during the 1920s, starring in classics like The Big Parade and Flesh and the Devil. However, his transition to talkies was fraught with challenges. A persistent rumor was that Gilbert's voice, reportedly high-pitched or effeminate, did not suit sound films. While this claim has been largely debunked, with recordings proving his voice was perfectly adequate, the perception took hold and harmed his image. Additionally, on-set conflicts with MGM studio head Louis B. Mayer played a significant role in his decline. Mayer reportedly disliked Gilbert and may have sabotaged his career by assigning him to subpar projects and providing little promotional support. Gilbert's first talkie, His Glorious Night, 1929, was poorly received, with audiences mocking his romantic dialogue delivery. This further tarnished his reputation and solidified the narrative that he couldn't handle sound. His later films failed to recapture his former glory, and by the mid-1930s, his career was effectively over. Plagued by personal struggles, including failed relationships and alcoholism, Gilbert passed away in 1936 at just 38 years old, a tragic symbol of how the talkie era reshaped Hollywood stardom. Clara Bow, known as the it girl of the silent film era, faced a dramatic decline in her career with the advent of sound films. Bow's rise to fame was built on her beauty, vivacious personality, and undeniable charm, which made her one of Hollywood's biggest stars in the late 1920s. However, the transition to talkies proved difficult for her. Bow's Brooklyn accent, once deemed charming in the silent era, was suddenly a liability in sound films, as it did not align with the polished, sophisticated voices expected of movie stars. Additionally, Bow struggled with the pressures of fame, including personal issues like mental health struggles, scandals, and turbulent relationships. These factors were exacerbated by the intense scrutiny of the press, which fueled her anxiety and led to erratic behavior. Her first talkie, The Wild Party, 1929, received a lukewarm reception, and her voice was criticized. As a result, Bow was unable to transition successfully into the sound era, and her career rapidly declined. Overwhelmed by her personal and professional challenges, she retired from acting in the early 1930s. Though she made some attempts at a comeback, the changing landscape of Hollywood had left her behind, and she spent her remaining years largely out of the public eye. Colleen Moore, one of the most popular and highest-paid actresses of the silent film era, saw her career decline with the arrival of sound films. Known for her roles in films like Flaming Youth, 1923, Moore became a symbol of the jazz age, captivating audiences with her flapper persona and bubbly charm. However, her transition to talkies was less successful. While Moore had the looks and talent to make the shift, the technological demands of sound films were a challenge. Her distinctive voice, once considered a minor issue in silent films, was now a liability. Critics felt her voice didn't match the youthful, sparkling image she had built on screen, and her transition to sound roles wasn't as smooth as some of her contemporaries. Despite this, Moore continued to work in Hollywood, though her roles were smaller and less glamorous. By the early 1930s, her popularity had waned, and she was relegated to less significant parts in films. In the mid-1930s, she retired from acting to focus on her personal life and business ventures. Though she made occasional returns to film later in life, Moore's career was never the same, and she remains an example of how the transition to sound films could disrupt the careers of even the brightest stars of the silent era. Ramon Novaro, a leading matinee idol of the silent film era, struggled to maintain his career with the advent of sound films. Known for his striking looks and charismatic performances, Novaro was a top star in the late 1920s, particularly famous for his role in Ben-Hur, 1925. However, his transition to talkies was difficult. Novaro's deep, rich voice, which had never been a focus in silent films, was found to be less suited to the demands of sound cinema. His vocal range was limited, and critics and audiences did not respond well to his speaking roles. Unlike other silent stars who made smoother transitions, Novaro's performances in early sound films were often criticized for their lack of emotional depth and resonance. Despite attempts to revive his career with talkies, Novaro's popularity waned in the early 1930s. His earlier success had relied heavily on his physical presence and silent performances, and these qualities did not translate well to the new era of sound. He was relegated to smaller roles, and his career never fully recovered. Novaro's later years were marked by personal struggles, including financial difficulties and a less public life, and his once glittering Hollywood career faded into obscurity. Norma Talmadge, one of the biggest stars of the silent film era, saw her illustrious career end abruptly with the arrival of sound films. Known for her beauty, elegance, and dramatic talent, Talmadge was a queen of the silent screen, with major films like Smiles, 1924, and Secrets, 1924, showcasing her star power. However, her transition to talkies was a struggle. When sound films became the industry standard, Talmadge's voice was found to be at odds with the glamorous, sophisticated image she had built. Her voice, which some considered unrefined, did not match the idealized image of the silent star, and it contributed to a public perception that she could not make the leap to sound films. Despite her success in silent cinema, Talmadge chose not to adapt to the new medium. Rather than attempt a comeback, she retired from acting in 1930, choosing to focus on her personal life and business ventures. She had the option to continue working in sound films, but her refusal to alter her image or embrace the demands of the new era marked the end of her Hollywood career. Talmadge's decision to retire rather than adapt reflects the difficulties many silent film stars faced during a transition to talkies. Buster Keaton, a pioneering comedic genius known for his mastery of physical humor and innovative silent film techniques, faced significant challenges with the arrival of sound films. His silent films, such as The General, 1926, and Sherlock Jr., 1924, showcased his brilliant slapstick comedy and his ability to perform elaborate stunts, making him one of the greatest silent film stars. However, the transition to talkies proved difficult for Keaton. Unlike other stars, Keaton did not initially struggle with his voice. His calm, deadpan delivery actually worked well in sound films. However, the creative freedom he had enjoyed in the silent era quickly evaporated with the new technological demands of sound. The rise of talkies introduced studio pressures, and Keaton, who had once controlled nearly every aspect of his projects, found himself losing creative control. He was forced into a more formulaic style of filmmaking, which contrasted sharply with his earlier work, where he had been an innovator and author. In addition to these creative constraints, Keaton faced personal struggles, including a failed marriage and issues with alcohol. By the early 1930s, his film career had stalled, and he was relegated to lower-budget films. While Keaton continued to work throughout his life, he never fully regained the creative independence and artistic success he had in the silent era. His career's decline in the sound era stands as a reminder of the struggles many silent film stars faced as Hollywood transitioned to sound. Louise Brooks, best known for her iconic role in Pandora's Box, 1929, was a major star of the silent film era, celebrated for her beauty, boldness, and unique screen presence. However, her career took a sharp downturn with the arrival of sound films, and much of her downfall can be attributed to her refusal to conform to Hollywood's studio system. Brooks was known for her independent spirit, which clashed with the rigid structure of the studio system that dominated Hollywood at the time. Unlike many stars who adhered to the industry's expectations, Brooks rejected the strict control over her image and career. She famously left Hollywood for Europe to pursue more artistic and independent roles, which limited her opportunities in the U.S. when sound films began to take over. While her distinctive beauty and charisma should have made the transition to talkies seamless, Brooks's career was hindered by her refusal to play by Hollywood's rules. Her voice, which was considered too modern and too sharp for the roles studios envisioned for her, also did not match the glamorous, melodious voices that were expected of leading ladies in sound films. As a result, Brooks quickly found herself out of favor in Hollywood, and her career stalled. Though she made a few sound films, including Beggars of Life, 1928, her fame faded rapidly. In the 1930s, she retired from acting and spent the remainder of her life in relative obscurity, later gaining recognition as a symbol of silent film rebellion. Brooks's career decline highlights the tensions between artistic independence and the demands of Hollywood's star system during the transition to sound cinema. Harold Lloyd, one of the biggest comedic stars of the silent film era, faced a mixed transition to sound films. Known for his glasses character and his daring physical stunts, Lloyd was a major box office draw during the 1920s, starring in films like Safety Last, 1923, and The Freshman, 1925. However, when sound films emerged, his career experienced both challenges and successes. Lloyd's transition to talkies was smoother than many of his peers due to his solid, versatile speaking voice, which worked well for sound. He made a successful transition with films like Welcome Danger, 1929. But despite this early success, Lloyd's popularity never fully regained the heights it had reached in the silent era. Audiences had grown accustomed to the larger-than-life physical comedy of the silent era, and the more dialogue-driven nature of sound films didn't highlight his strengths in the same way. Moreover, the rise of new comedic stars like Charlie Chaplin and the shifting tastes of the Great Depression made it difficult for Lloyd to compete. Though he continued to make films throughout the 1930s, he never recaptured the same level of fame. Lloyd gradually retired from acting in the late 1930s, transitioning to producing and focusing on his personal life. Despite his success in the sound era, his silent era popularity remained unmatched, and his legacy is often overshadowed by the stars of the new age. Mary Pickford, known as America's Sweetheart, was one of the most beloved and successful stars of the silent film era. Her image as the innocent, charming young woman won the hearts of audiences worldwide in films like Little Annie Rooney, 1925, and Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm, 1917. However, with the arrival of sound films, Pickford struggled to adapt, leading to the end of her acting career. Although Pickford had a successful transition with her voice, her once iconic image began to feel out of place in the sound era. The innocent, childlike persona that had made her so popular no longer resonated with changing tastes, and the shift toward more mature or more complex characters made it harder for her to maintain her former stardom. Her first talkie, Coquette, 1929, won her an Academy Award for Best Actress, but it failed to ignite the same level of audience enthusiasm as her silent films had. Despite the Oscar recognition, Pickford's career never regained the heights it had reached in the silent era. Her image, once so beloved, was increasingly seen as outdated, and the demands of the sound era didn't align with the roles she had made famous. After a few unsuccessful talkie experiments, she chose to retire from acting in 1933, instead focusing on her work as a producer. Pickford's retirement marked the end of an era, as she, like many silent film stars, found it difficult to adapt to the changing cinematic landscape. Douglas Fairbanks, one of the silent film era's biggest stars, faced significant challenges with the rise of sound films, which led to his early retirement from acting. Known for his swashbuckling roles in films like The Mark of Zorro, 1920, and The Thief of Baghdad, 1924, Fairbanks was celebrated for his physicality, athleticism, and charismatic performances. His roles were defined by high-energy stunts and adventurous plots, making him one of the most popular stars of the silent era. However, with the advent of sound films, Fairbanks's career hit a stumbling block. His distinctive voice and style, which had never been a focus in the silent films, did not translate well to talkies. The transition to sound required a different kind of performance, one that emphasized dialogue and voice work, elements that didn't suit Fairbanks' established screen persona as a dashing, action-oriented hero. Despite his initial attempts to adapt, including the talkie, The Taming of the Shrew, 1929, Fairbanks struggled to regain his former popularity. His larger-than-life image, built on physical comedy and swashbuckling roles, became less relevant in the era of dialogue-driven films. By the early 1930s, Fairbanks had retired from acting, choosing to step away from the spotlight and focus on other interests, including producing and philanthropy. His early retirement marks him as another iconic star of the silent era who was unable to fully adapt to the demands of the sound era. Sessue Hayakawa, a major star in the silent film era, faced a significant decline in his career with the advent of sound films. A charismatic leading man, Hayakawa was known for his roles in films like The Cheat, 1915, and The Dragon Painter, 1919, where he portrayed complex characters that transcended the stereotypes often assigned to Asian actors. His exotic appeal and strong screen presence made him a box office draw in the silent era. However, with the rise of talkies, Hayakawa's career hit a wall. One of the main reasons for his decline was the limited opportunities for Asian actors in Hollywood, particularly in sound films. The industry had already struggled with racial stereotypes, and the introduction of sound further restricted the roles available to non-white actors. Hollywood's focus on dialogue-driven storytelling made it difficult for an actor like Hayakawa, whose English was not as fluent as his white counterparts, to find significant parts. Hayakawa appeared in a few sound films, but none matched the success of his silent-era roles. By the 1930s, his prominence in Hollywood had waned, and he turned to working in Europe and later Japan, where he found more opportunities. His story highlights the challenges faced by Asian actors in early Hollywood, particularly during the transition from silent films to sound, and how racial barriers impacted their careers. Lillian Gish, one of the greatest actresses of the silent film era, successfully made the transition to sound films, but her career trajectory shifted significantly. Known for her ethereal presence, delicate features, and emotional depth, Gish was a star in silent classics like The Birth of a Nation, 1915, and Broken Blossoms, 1919. Her performances relied heavily on visual storytelling, where her facial expressions and body language spoke volumes without the need for dialogue. When sound films emerged, Gish's distinctive style, which had made her a silent film legend, became less suited to the new demands of cinema. While she was able to make the transition, her soft, refined voice and the subtlety of her performances were not well suited for the more dramatic and dialogue-heavy roles that sound films required. As a result, she found it difficult to regain the prominence she had enjoyed in the silent era. In the sound era, Gish's roles became smaller, often relegated to supporting parts, and her once dominant presence in leading roles faded. Despite this shift, she continued to work in film and even returned to the stage, proving her adaptability and enduring talent. However, her legacy as the First Lady of American cinema was forever tied to her silent film work, where her ability to convey emotion without words made her one of the era's most iconic stars. Vilma Banky, a Hungarian-born actress who rose to fame in the silent film era, experienced a sharp decline in her career with the advent of sound films. Known for her roles in romantic dramas like The Eagle, 1925, and The Night is Young, 1928, Banky was celebrated for her beauty and charm, quickly becoming one of Hollywood's most popular leading ladies in the late 1920s. However, with the rise of sound films, Banky faced a significant challenge. Her thick Hungarian accent, which had been less noticeable in silent films, became a major obstacle in the dialogue-driven world of talkies. The limitations of her accent made it difficult for her to land the same leading roles, as audiences in studios were not accustomed to her speech, which was considered out of place in the new era of film. Despite a few attempts to continue her career, Banky's opportunities in Hollywood dwindled as sound films took over. In 1930, after a brief stint in a few sound films, she chose to retire from acting. Though she had been a major star in the silent era, the demands of the talkie revolution made it difficult for her to maintain her prominence, and her career ended prematurely. Banky's story highlights how accents and linguistic challenges affected the careers of many actors in the early sound era. Rudolph Valentino, one of the most iconic stars of the silent film era, passed away in 1926, just before the full emergence of sound films. He was known for his roles in films like The Sheik, 1921, and Blood and Sand, 1922, where his smoldering looks and passionate performances made him a heartthrob and a major box office draw. However, his career ended abruptly due to his untimely death at the age of 31, just as the industry was on the brink of transition from silent films to talkies. While Valentino did not live to experience the full impact of sound films, many historians speculate that his heavily accented English might have posed challenges had he been alive during the rise of talkies. Valentino, born in Italy, spoke with a noticeable accent that could have been a barrier in the new era of cinema, where clear, articulate dialogue became crucial. The talkie revolution led to changes in how stars were marketed, and while many silent film actors adapted successfully, others, particularly those with strong accents, found it more difficult to continue their careers. Had Valentino lived longer, it is likely that his accent would have been scrutinized, especially given the industry's growing preference for more Americanized or neutral voices. The speculation around his potential struggle with sound films remains part of the conversation about how the silent film era's greatest stars would have adapted to the new era. Charlie Chaplin, one of the most iconic figures in the silent film era, successfully navigated the transition to sound films, but not without significant challenges. Known for his ability to convey deep emotion and humor through physical comedy and expressive pantomime, Chaplin was one of the most beloved stars of the silent era. His character, the Tramp, became a symbol of silent film and was recognized worldwide. However, Chaplin's reluctance to embrace dialogue in his films created obstacles as sound films gained dominance. Unlike many of his peers, who adapted quickly to the new technology, Chaplin resisted the shift toward talkies. He famously believed that silent film had a universal language that transcended words, and he felt that dialogue would diminish the power of visual comedy. When Chaplin finally incorporated sound into his films, beginning with The Great Dictator, 1940, he did so with caution, using dialogue sparingly. Though the film was a critical success and contained some of his most memorable lines, Chaplin's later works, such as Monsieur Verdoux's, 1947, and Limelight, 1952, never reached the same universal acclaim as his silent masterpieces. Chaplin's reluctance to fully embrace the sound era meant that his films in the later years of his career were often more niche, drawing admiration from critics, but not always from the mass audiences that had adored his silent films. While Chaplin's legacy as a silent film genius remained secure, his transition to sound marked a different, more complex phase of his career, one that lacked the broad appeal of his earlier work.